Before history crowned him great, the world whispered a different word, a word buried under ash, drowned in slave markets, and silenced behind palace walls. Tonight, you will not see Alexander through statues, victories, or legends. You will see him through the eyes history refused to record, the women who watched their cities burn, the brides taken as trophies, the voices erased so greatness could sound clean. But before we open this forbidden chapter, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now, because stories like this are the ones history tried hardest to hide. And if you want more dark, cinematic truths uncovered from ancient empires, press like on this video so this story reaches those who were never taught the cost of conquest. Stay with me, because what begins with fire in Greece will end in silence across an empire. And once you hear it, the word great will never sound the same again. The city that burned so others would obey, they still call him great, but greatness has a smell smoke, iron, and panic in the lungs. A Greek city didn't fall in war. It was erased on purpose, like a warning carved into human bodies. And outside the flames, thousands waited in silence for the fate history hides in one clean sentence. They were sold. Thebes, autumn 335 BC, not a foreign frontier, not some distant barbarian place the world wouldn't miss. A Greek city old, proud, educated, and painfully familiar. It should have been protected by the same civilization Alexander claimed to defend. Instead, it became his first public demonstration of fear. The walls were breached fast, because speed was the first weapon. The Macedonian army moved like a machine that didn't come to win, but to erase the idea of resistance itself. Men died in streets they had walked as children. Homes that had stood for generations became tinder. And above it all, the message was simple. A young king could not be tested without consequences that would echo through every other city's sleep. The slaughter ended, but the nightmare did not. Because war has a second phase that doesn't look like battle. Once the noise of fighting faded, the surviving population was pushed out like debris. Women, children, the elderly, those who had no vote in the decision to resist and no armor to protect them when that decision failed. They were herded into open ground outside the walls, surrounded by soldiers who did not need to shout anymore. The women understood what was happening without being told. In the Greek world, slavery wasn't rumor. It was an industry. It had rules, routines, and a marketplace. And the most terrifying part was how ordinary it felt to the men doing it. Inside the city, there was one story the ancient writers loved to preserve because it makes the king look noble. A woman named Timoclea, proud, defiant, intelligent, was assaulted by a Thracian officer searching for wealth. When he demanded her valuables, she told him she had thrown them into a well. He leaned over to look. She pushed him in. Then she dropped stones until the sound stopped. Soldiers dragged her before Alexander, expecting punishment. She told him who she was, tied her identity to a family name that carried honor and war. Alexander admired the aesthetic of defiance. He released her. That is the story they repeat, because it flatters the conqueror. It gives the audience a clean feeling. See, he respected courage, he spared a woman, he had moral restraint. But it is also a curtain, because while Timoclea walked free, tens of thousands did not. Outside the burning city, a larger truth waited, unwritten, unnamed, and perfectly convenient for historians who preferred to praise the victor instead of counting the victims. The sorting began, not with cruelty that looked dramatic, but with cruelty that looked like paperwork. Young separated from old, children pulled from mothers if buyers paid better for them alone. Bodies evaluated the way animals are evaluated: teeth, muscle, health, age. The women who had once lived as citizens' wives and daughters were turned into inventory. The soldiers weren't debating morality. They were processing spoils. A conquered city had produced profit, and profit had to be organized. That's what made it horrific. The routine. The calm, the certainty that this was normal. The markets couldn't even absorb them at full value. 30,000 bodies flooding the trade routes depressed prices across Greece. Imagine hearing that detail as a woman waiting to be sold, realizing your suffering had become an economic event. Your worth wasn't tied to your life, your memories, your family, or your name. It was tied to supply and demand. Too many of you existed, so you were worth less. And somewhere nearby, families chose fire instead. They locked their doors and burned alive together, parents and children, because they understood something history rarely says out loud. When death looks kinder than survival, survival must be unspeakable. Alexander's supporters called this strategy a policy. Surrender and receive mercy. Resist and be destroyed. It sounded rational, even clean, until you see who paid the price. The decision to resist was made by men in councils and war rooms. The consequence landed on women who were never asked. The men who gambled could die quickly in battle. The women who never gambled at all were forced into a future measured in ownership. And as Thebes turned to ash behind them, the survivors learned the final lesson of Alexander's greatness. History can describe an atrocity in 5 passive words and move on. The city was taken. The inhabitants were sold. The conqueror marched onward. But the women didn't march forward into a new chapter. Many were carried into it like cargo, disappearing into households, ports, and markets, their names replaced, their past sealed behind a door no historian bothered to open. Because Thebes was only the beginning, and far ahead, an island city would shut its gates. And Alexander would decide to make an example so visible that the sea itself would remember it. The island that refused to kneel, Tyre, 332 BC, an island city floating half a mile off the Phoenician coast, surrounded not just by water, but by centuries of confidence. Tyre had watched empires rise and exhaust themselves against its walls. Nebuchadnezzar himself had tried to break it and failed after 13 years. The Tyrians believed geography was stronger than any king. When Alexander arrived and demanded entry to perform ritual sacrifice inside their temple, they offered him a compromise. He could worship in the old mainland ruins, not on the island itself. It was a polite refusal wrapped in diplomacy, but Alexander did not hear diplomacy. He heard defiance. And defiance to him was a disease that had to be burned out before it spread. The decision he made next did not resemble strategy. It resembled obsession. If the sea protected Tyre, then the sea would be removed. His engineers began constructing a causeway from the mainland to the island, a road built directly across open water. Stone, timber, rubble, entire ruins dismantled and thrown into the sea to form a growing spine of land. Day by day the road crept forward, an unnatural extension of Macedonian will. The Tyrians fought back constantly. Fire ships drifted into the construction lines at night, exploding into towers of flame. Archers rained arrows. Catapults shattered scaffolding. Workers died building a road that should not have existed. But Alexander did not stop. Every setback hardened him. Every death fed the fury building beneath his calm exterior. 7 months passed. 7 months of resistance, humiliation, delay. For Alexander, time itself became an insult. The longer Tyre stood, the more dangerous it was as an example to the rest of the world. If one city could refuse him, others might believe they could too. So the causeway continued, wider, stronger, until siege towers rolled across it like moving fortresses. Naval forces joined, surrounding the island from the sea while the land bridge closed from the front. Tyre was no longer an island. It had been forcibly attached to its conqueror. When the walls finally fell, the Macedonian army did not enter as soldiers. They entered as accumulated rage. The fighting in the streets was savage, but brief. The Tyrians knew what had happened to Thebes 3 years earlier. They fought not to win, but to delay the inevitable. 8,000 died in the slaughter that followed the breach. And then came the act that transformed punishment into theater. 2,000 Tyrian men of military age were crucified along the shoreline. Crosses erected in rows facing the sea, bodies suspended where every passing ship could see them. It was not execution, it was advertisement. Sailors carried the image across the Mediterranean like a traveling warning. This is what resistance looks like when Alexander answers it. The message was carved not into stone, but into flesh. While the crosses darkened the coastline, the rest of the population was processed in a system that had already been perfected at Thebes. 30,000 civilians again, mostly women and children, were gathered, sorted, evaluated. The repetition is what makes it chilling. The same numbers, the same procedures, the same silent understanding among soldiers that this was standard aftermath, not atrocity. Young women were separated first. Children pulled away if sold better individually. Families dissolved in minutes under commercial logic. Phoenician women, especially Tyrians, held high market value. They possessed textile and dyeing skills prized across the Mediterranean. The famous Tyrian purple, the dye of royalty, had been produced by their hands in freedom. Now those same hands increased their value in bondage. Buyers examined fingers for the stains and calluses of skilled labor. Talent became price. Culture became commodity. The very abilities that once elevated them within their society now elevated their sale worth in another man's household. The phrase appeared again in the histories. As clean and bloodless as ever, the inhabitants were sold. 5 words that closed the door on tens of thousands of individual endings. Women taken from island homes were shipped to cities they had never seen: Athens, Corinth, Alexandria, ports where language, customs, even sunlight felt foreign. Names were replaced. Identities dissolved into ownership records. Children grew up never knowing the shoreline where their fathers had been crucified. And the sea itself was permanently changed. The causeway Alexander built never disappeared. Sand accumulated around it, turning the island into a peninsula. Geography had been rewritten to memorialize conquest. Tyre survived, but never again as the untouchable island it once was. Even its landscape carried the scar of defiance. Alexander moved on quickly, as he always did. Siege concluded, message delivered, army advancing toward the next objective. But the brutality at Tyre introduced something new, not just destruction, but spectacle cruelty. Punishment designed to be seen, remembered, feared. And the most disturbing truth lingered beneath it all. Tyre had resisted and was annihilated. Yet the next great horror would happen to a city that surrendered completely. The city that surrendered and burned anyway. Persepolis, 330 BC, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire. A city not built for defense, but for display. Terraces of carved stone rising from the Iranian plateau. Staircases etched with images of subject nations bringing tribute. Columns crowned with bulls and lions staring across a kingdom that had ruled for 2 centuries. When Alexander approached, there was no defiance, no closed gates, no 7-month siege. The city opened itself. The garrison surrendered. By the conqueror's own rules, submit and be spared, Persepolis should have survived untouched. But policies that terrify others do not always restrain the man who created them. The Macedonian army entered without resistance, and that was precisely what made what followed so revealing. Soldiers did not rush in anger. They moved with calculated hunger. Homes were entered methodically. Doors kicked open not in battle frenzy, but in expectation. Wealth was everywhere: silver vessels, gold ornaments, fabrics dyed in colors that only imperial tribute could afford. The royal treasury alone was so vast that ancient sources claimed it required thousands of animals to carry away. 20,000 mules, 5,000 camels numbers, so immense they sound mythical, yet consistent across accounts. 2 centuries of imperial collection stripped in days. But treasure was not the only object gathered. In private residences, women were seized with the same efficiency as gold. There had been no resistance, no excuse of vengeance. The city had obeyed. It did not matter. Submission did not shield the powerless from greed. The soldiers had marched thousands of miles and had been promised the richest city in the world. They meant to collect, and they did not distinguish between vault and bedroom. Ancient writers, usually cautious with description, became unusually direct about what happened inside those homes. They spoke of violence, of women dragged into the streets, of cries echoing between palace walls carved with royal processions. The conqueror who could show restraint when political leverage demanded it allowed this. Because Persepolis represented more than a city, it represented symbolic victory, and symbolism demanded spectacle. For days, plunder continued. Wealth piled in transport caravans, stretching beyond the horizon. Families were dismantled as casually as furniture removed from a room. The women gathered into holding areas outside the residential quarters understood what came next, even if they had never seen it before. They had heard of Thebes. They had heard of Tyre. Markets awaited. Prices would be assigned. A city that surrendered learned that obedience did not guarantee mercy, only utility did. Then came the night of fire. A banquet in the royal palace, wine flowing beneath ceilings painted with gold and lapis. Alexander and his commanders celebrating triumph in the very hall where Persian kings once received tribute from the world. Among the guests was Tyre, an Athenian courtesan. In the intoxicated heat of celebration, she proposed something poetic: burn the palace in revenge for Xerxes' destruction of Athens a century and a half earlier. The symmetry intoxicated the room as much as the wine. Alexander took the first torch. Flames climbed carved beams that had taken decades to shape. Smoke swallowed reliefs depicting nations bowing in orderly procession. Columns cracked under heat, statues collapsed, centuries of architectural achievement reduced to glowing ruin in a single night of drunken symbolism. Ancient historians would later insist Alexander regretted it almost immediately, that he ordered the fire extinguished. Regret, however, does not rebuild stone. From the holding areas where captives waited, the women of Persepolis watched the sky turn orange. For them, the burning carried a deeper cruelty than plunder alone. Plunder strips possessions. Fire erases return. A woman sold into slavery might hold the faint belief that one day she could see her city again. That belief vanished in smoke. Streets became ash. Temples blackened. The ceremonial center of their world reduced to ruin visible for miles. The burning of Persepolis is often told as a dramatic anecdote about Alexander's temper, or Tyre's influence, or revenge fulfilled after generations. It is rarely told as the moment thousands realized they no longer had a place to imagine returning to. The conqueror's impulse is famous. The conquered woman's silence is not recorded anywhere. Alexander marched east soon after, carrying the treasure of Persepolis and leaving its smoke behind him. To the historians who admired him, the event became complexity of flaw within greatness. But to the women processed through markets in the aftermath, it was something simpler and more final. A surrendered city had been devoured. The rule was broken, and nothing in the empire could feel secure again. Because if surrender did not protect you, what could? The king who began destroying his own. By the time Alexander left the ruins of Persepolis behind him, something quieter but more dangerous had begun shifting inside his empire. The terror he unleashed on conquered cities did not remain contained there. It followed him inward, into banquet halls, command tents, and the fragile space between loyalty and fear. Because a man who demands absolute submission from the world eventually begins demanding it from the people closest to him. The first fracture appeared in a place meant for celebration, a victory banquet, heavy with wine, thick with the false warmth that follows conquest. Among the men reclining near the king was Cletus the Black, a general whose name should have been immortalized beside Alexander's, because years earlier at the Battle of the Granicus, Cletus had saved his life. A Persian blade had been inches from splitting Alexander's skull when Cletus severed the attacker's arm. In that instant, the future empire had been preserved by another man's reflex. But memory weakens when ego grows. As wine deepened tongues and loosened restraint, Cletus spoke openly. He reminded the king that victories belonged not to one man alone, but to the army that bled for him. He criticized the increasing adoption of Persian customs, the robes, the court rituals, the expectation that Macedonian officers bow like subjects instead of standing like comrades. Cletus was not whispering rebellion. He was voicing discomfort shared by many veterans who had marched beside Alexander since youth. Alexander did not hear concern. He heard disrespect. Witnesses described the moment as sudden but inevitable. Rage rose fast, sharpened by alcohol and insecurity. Arguments erupted across the hall, friends trying to restrain both men. For a moment, it seemed the storm might pass. Then Alexander seized a spear from a guard. In one violent motion, he drove it through the chest of the man who had once saved his life. Cletus died on the banquet floor, surrounded by officers who had followed Alexander across continents. The king's reaction came too late to matter. He wept, locked himself away, refused food for days, calling Cletus' name in grief. Ancient historians preserved these tears carefully, polishing them into proof of remorse, proof of humanity. But grief does not reverse a spear thrust. And the lesson the army absorbed was not about regret, it was about danger. If a life-saving general could be killed for speaking too freely, what protection did anyone else possess? Fear replaced camaraderie. Soon after, another shadow, Philotas, son of Parmenion, one of the most senior and respected generals in the Macedonian command structure. Philotas was accused of involvement in a conspiracy against Alexander. The evidence was thin, even by ancient standards, and the sources themselves expressed doubt. Yet doubt mattered little once suspicion entered the king's mind. Philotas was arrested, tortured, forced into confession under unbearable pain. Torture manufactures truth that authority wants to hear. He was executed. But Philotas was only the surface target. The deeper threat was his father. Parmenion commanded vital supply lines hundreds of miles away. A veteran who had served both Philip and Alexander, who had helped build the very army now conquering Asia. Rather than risk the old general reacting to his son's execution, Alexander sent assassins ahead of the news. They found Parmenion reading a letter. They killed him before he understood why. Loyalty of decades ended in silent preemption. The pattern deepened further with Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew and the expedition's official historian. His role was to record Alexander's greatness for posterity. Yet when Alexander began adopting Persian court rituals, especially proskynesis, the act of bowing in divine reverence, Callisthenes refused. He argued that such worship was fit for gods, not men. Refusal became treason. He was arrested, imprisoned, and died in captivity. The man assigned to immortalize Alexander's glory was erased for reminding him of his mortality. History itself was being curated through fear. By now, the transformation was undeniable. The conqueror who destroyed cities for resistance had begun destroying relationships for discomfort. Those who loved him, saved him, advised him, none were immune once they challenged the myth he was building around himself. Absolute power demands absolute narrative control. And this inner brutality mattered beyond palace walls, because the same mind deciding the fate of loyal generals was deciding the fate of conquered populations. If dissent from friends ended in execution, mercy toward strangers required calculation, not compassion. The army marched on, but its atmosphere had changed. Respect had thinned into obedience. Conversations lowered into whispers. Around the king, loyalty still existed, but it was now reinforced by fear rather than devotion. And ahead of them lay a decision that would test how far Alexander's need to surpass legends had grown. a decision not against enemies, but against the limits of nature itself. The desert that consumed the uncounted. By 325 BC, Alexander's army had marched farther than any Macedonian force in history. They had crossed mountains that split continents, rivers that drowned supply lines, and kingdoms that once seemed unreachable. But exhaustion had begun settling into the bones of the men who followed him. 8 years of continuous war had turned veterans into ghosts wearing armor. When the army reached the Hyphasis River in India and refused to march farther east, it was the first time Alexander faced an enemy he could not conquer, his own soldiers' refusal. He withdrew, but withdrawal did not mean humility. It meant redirection. The logical return route west lay through fertile lands, known roads, and established supply corridors. Generals expected that path. It was safe, efficient, survivable. Alexander chose the opposite. He chose the Jedrosian Desert, a wasteland, stretching along the Makran coast of what is now southern Pakistan and Iran, a place ancient armies avoided for a reason. Cyrus the Great had attempted to cross it and lost most of his forces. Even legends warned against it. That warning became temptation. Alexander wanted to succeed where mythic rulers had failed. Glory was no longer measured in battles alone. It required outdoing history itself. The army entered the desert in a long, vulnerable column. Not just soldiers, but the living ecosystem that followed conquest. Merchants, servants, craftsmen, camp followers, and women, the wives and companions accumulated over years of campaign. Some were Macedonian women who had traveled east with husbands. Others were women absorbed from conquered lands, woven into the army's domestic life. They cooked, cleaned, tended wounds, bore children. They had no voice in military decisions, yet they walked every mile those decisions demanded. The desert offered nothing back. Water was the first casualty. Maps proved unreliable, springs dry, wells buried by shifting sands. Rations were cut almost immediately, then cut again. Baggage animals, horses, camels, mules began dying in rows, collapsing under heat that radiated from sky and earth alike. When animals died, supplies died with them. Food rotted in unreachable saddlebags. Medical stores vanished beneath carcasses. Every death made the next death easier. The army marched mostly at night, trying to outrun the sun. During the day, they dug shallow trenches in the sand, lying inside them to escape the worst heat. It barely helped. Skin cracked, lips bled, tongues swelled. The desert did not attack violently. It erased slowly, with patience more terrifying than battle. Then came the flood. One night the army camped inside a dry riverbed, its flat surface offering rare comfort. While they slept, rain fell miles away in unseen mountains. Without warning, a wall of water roared through the channel. Tents vanished instantly. Soldiers were dragged into darkness before they could stand. Women, children, animals swept together in a violent current that disappeared as quickly as it came. By morning, the riverbed was dry again. Bodies and supplies gone, as if the desert had swallowed them whole. But thirst remained the true executioner. Water distribution followed hierarchy. Officers first, soldiers second, camp followers last. In early weeks, the final rations were small. Later, there were none. Women carrying children walked on legs that no longer obeyed them. Some children died in their mothers' arms, yet the mothers continued carrying the bodies, unable to release what they had protected for so long. When women collapsed, the column did not stop. It could not. Stopping meant collective death. To fall behind in the Jedrosian desert was to vanish without witness. Ancient historians tried to count the losses, but focused mainly on soldiers, because soldiers affected military strength. Civilian deaths were barely recorded. Tens of thousands likely perished, yet the exact number dissolved into sand. Women who had survived sieges, slavery, forced marches, died of thirst because a king wanted to outperform legends. One story survives like a shard of irony. A soldier once found a small helmet filled with precious water and offered it to Alexander. The king poured it into the sand rather than drink alone. Historians celebrate this as proof of leadership solidarity, but symbolism does not rehydrate the dying. The gesture inspired morale, but it did not change the outcome for the thousands still collapsing behind the marching line. When the army finally staggered out of the desert after 60 days, it was no longer the same force that had entered. It was thinner, haunted, stripped of the illusion that conquest always moved forward. Victory had been achieved against geography, but at a cost, paid largely by those whose names were never written. And as the survivors regrouped in Persian territories, another spectacle awaited them, not of death this time, but of ceremony. A mass wedding that would be remembered as unity, while hiding another form of possession beneath silk and gold. The brides of empire, the silence after greatness. By 324 BC, Alexander's empire stretched across continents, but conquest alone was no longer enough. Territory could be seized by force, but permanence required something deeper: control over bloodlines, loyalty, and legacy. So in the Persian city of Susa, Alexander staged one of the most elaborate ceremonies of the ancient world. Not a victory parade, not a coronation. A mass wedding. 80 of his highest officers were ordered to marry Persian noblewomen in a single imperial ritual designed to fuse conqueror and conquered into one ruling class. The hall was built for spectacle. Gold vessels, embroidered robes, incense curling toward painted ceilings. Persian princesses and noble daughters stood dressed in ceremonial silk, their families already broken by the very army they were now being joined to. Alexander himself married Darius III's daughter, Statera, alongside another Persian princess, Parysatis. Around him, generals took the hands of women whose fathers had died defending cities those same generals had assaulted. Ancient historians described the event as visionary, a symbolic union of East and West, proof that Alexander sought unity rather than domination. But ceremonies record appearances, not consent. The Persian women had no voice in the arrangements. Their marriages were political architecture, designed to stabilize rule through lineage. A noble bride could legitimize Macedonian authority over Persian provinces. Children from these unions would embody the empire's future. To Alexander, it was strategy disguised as harmony. To the women, it was possession formalized under torchlight. Imagine standing across from the man whose army destroyed your homeland, whose campaigns toppled your father's throne, whose victories erased your nation's sovereignty, and being told to take his hand before witnesses. The sources never record their expressions. No tears, no resistance, no words. Their silence is not evidence of peace. It is evidence of omission. History preserved the conqueror's vision, not the captive's reality. For a moment, the illusion held. The marriages were celebrated, feasts lasting days, gifts distributed in abundance. Scholars later pointed to Susa as proof that Alexander dreamed of cultural integration rather than endless war. But the durability of a policy reveals its sincerity, and this one shattered almost immediately. In June 323 BC, Alexander died in Babylon at the age of 32. Fever consumed him after days of heavy drinking. Whether disease or poison ended him remains debated, but the result was instant. The empire fractured overnight. Generals who had marched together for over a decade turned on each other before the body was cold. Territories were carved like spoils of war. Egypt, Persia, Macedonia divided, claimed, contested. And the marriages at Susa collapsed just as quickly. Within months, nearly every Macedonian officer abandoned his Persian wife. The grand fusion dissolved into inconvenience. Only one major general, Seleucus, maintained his union. The rest discarded theirs as relics of a political performance that no longer served their ambitions. The women who had been paraded as symbols of unity were left behind in a world where their own empire was gone and the men they had been bound to had returned west. History does not record what became of most of them. Did they return to surviving relatives? Were they absorbed into new courts? Did they raise children alone, heirs to fractured legacies neither fully Macedonian nor Persian? Their futures dissolved into archival silence, just like the women sold at Thebes, Tyre, and Persepolis. Conquest had taken their autonomy. Ceremony had taken their bodies. Abandonment took what remained. Alexander's death did not free the enslaved either. The tens of thousands of women sold across 13 years of campaigns remained in bondage. Ownership transfers did not equal liberation. Children born into slavery inherited the condition. The consequences of conquest outlived the conqueror himself, embedding into generations that would never know the cities their mothers once called home. And yet, history remembers him primarily through marble statues and battlefield maps, the student of Aristotle, the undefeated strategist, the visionary who spread Hellenistic culture across the known world. These things are not false, but they are incomplete. They are the story told from the height of the throne, not from the holding areas outside burning cities. Because behind every city Alexander took, there were women who burned themselves rather than be captured. Women who stood on auction platforms while buyers assessed their worth. Women who watched palaces burn, knowing return was impossible. Women forced into political marriages that dissolved the moment power shifted. Women who died unnamed in deserts because glory demanded proof. Alexander wept, according to legend, because there were no more worlds left to conquer. His tears were recorded, repeated, immortalized. The grief of the conquered was not written with the same care. Their suffering exists only in fragments, between lines, behind passive sentences, buried beneath admiration. Greatness, history teaches, is often measured by what a man builds. But it is also measured by what and who he leaves broken behind him.